The incense drifted upward into the vaulted ceilings of cathedrals, mingling with whispers of doubt that were spreading through every corner of Europe. Bells tolled in every city and village, not only to mark the rhythm of worship, but to remind all that an age was being reshaped. Across the continent, the 16th century dawned with both brilliance and turmoil. The light of the Renaissance illuminated palaces, libraries, and courts, while at the same time shadows lengthened as faith and authority fractured. It was a world alive with promise, yet trembling with division, a world where ancient certainties could no longer hold the weight of new ideas. For 1,000 years, the Church had bound Christendom together. From kings who knelt before the Pope to peasants who found solace in ritual, all lived under Rome's spiritual authority. Yet that unity was shaken in 1517 when a German monk named Martin Luther set his challenge in motion at Wittenberg. His words questioned the very heart of papal authority and offered believers a new vision of faith. What began as a protest became a storm, spreading rapidly through the German states and across northern Europe. In Switzerland, in Scandinavia, in the Low Countries, reformers preached that salvation came not through the authority of Rome, but through the direct word of Scripture. Nobles saw in this rebellion an opportunity to seize wealth from the church, and common men and women discovered voices that spoke of faith in a more personal language. The unity of Europe shattered like glass, and with it, the political order that had long rested upon the church. At the center of this turbulent continent stood Charles V, heir to one of the most extraordinary inheritances in history. As King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, he ruled lands that stretched from Austria to the Netherlands, from Iberia to the New World. His power seemed immense, his dominion vast, and many feared that he might become a universal monarch. He carried the burden of defending Catholicism against the growing Protestant tide. And under his watch, Spanish armies marched across Europe, while galleons carried treasures from the Americas to fill his coffers. To the faithful, he was a bulwark of stability, yet his strength was constantly drained by the need to confront both the Protestants within his empire and the French beyond its borders. Even Charles, with all his crowns, could not stop the flood of division that spread from town to town, from throne to throne. England, perched on its island edge of Europe, seemed distant from these storms, but could never truly remain apart. Henry VIII, the larger-than-life monarch of the Tudor line, had once stood as a champion of Rome, earning the title Defender of the Faith. Yet personal ambition and dynastic desperation led him to break from the very church he had defended. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, aunt of Charles V, had failed to produce a surviving male heir driven by his desire for a son. Henry severed ties with Rome and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Monasteries were dissolved, their treasures seized, and papal authority cast aside. The English Reformation was unlike the movements on the continent, born less of theology than of politics and power, but its consequences were just as profound. The kingdom was torn between old and new. Nobles enriched themselves with church lands, while ordinary believers struggled between loyalty to tradition and obedience to their king. Within the royal household, the conflict was personal and cruel. For Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry and Catherine, the break with Rome was not simply a political shift. It was the humiliation of her mother, cast aside for another woman. It was her own disinheritance, her status reduced to that of illegitimacy. To her, the Protestant cause was not a matter of abstract doctrine, but the living source of her family's disgrace. The Reformation, in her eyes, had stolen her birthright and desecrated the faith she held sacred. By the middle of the 16th century, Europe was a chessboard of power and belief. Princes of Germany defied their emperor. France schemed against Spain. Spain itself struggled to hold an empire together, and England hovered in an uneasy balance between old loyalties and new identities. The continent was alive with armies, with sermons, with treaties, and with betrayals. Every monarch was forced to choose a side, every subject compelled to reckon with questions of conscience and allegiance. It was within this great storm that Mary's path was set. The fires of the Reformation, the looming shadow of Spain, and the turbulent legacy of her father combined to shape the world she would inherit. Her reign would not emerge from quiet times, but from the very heart of Europe's most dramatic upheaval. And so, before her story can be told, one must see the stage upon which she stepped, a stage already lit by the flames of faith and ambition, a stage where the fate of nations would be decided not only by swords and treaties, but by the convictions of the soul. Amid this vast storm of faith and power, the destinies of kingdoms were bound together with the fates of individuals. And nowhere was this more true than in England, where the Reformation was not only a matter of policy, but of family, of marriage, of blood. At the very heart of this upheaval stood a child, born into both privilege and peril, whose life would embody the struggles of her age. That child was Mary Tudor. She was born in 1516, the only surviving child of King Henry VIII and his queen, Catherine of Aragon. At her birth, church bells rang across the realm, and Londoners filled the streets to celebrate. Though some whispered disappointment that she was not a boy, she was welcomed as the hope of the Tudor dynasty, a delicate flame of continuity in a house still fragile on the throne. For her mother, Mary was a living answer to years of anxious prayers, and for her father, she was, at least in those early years, a cherished daughter. Mary's childhood began in splendor. She was raised in palaces decorated with tapestries, tutored by the best scholars, and taught Latin, French, Spanish, and even a touch of Greek. Music and learning filled her early days, and she quickly became a prodigy on the virginals, her small hands dancing across the keys. Ambassadors at court marveled at her intelligence and discipline. She carried herself with the poise of a princess destined for greatness, admired not only for her refinement, but also for her resemblance to her Spanish mother, who instilled in her both dignity and unshakable devotion to the Catholic faith. In those years of innocence, Mary's world seemed secure. She dined at tables heavy with gold plate, was dressed in gowns of rich velvet, and took part in courtly pageants where she appeared before her father's subjects as the radiant symbol of Tudor stability. Plans for her marriage were considered even in her infancy. One day to a French prince, another to the Emperor Charles V himself, her cousin on her mother's side. The stage of European politics seemed ready to welcome her as a bride who would bind kingdoms together, but beneath the glitter of the Tudor court lay shadows that a child could not see. Henry VIII's obsession with a male heir deepened with every passing year. Catherine, though once a beloved queen, grew older, and no son survived infancy. The warmth of Henry's affection cooled into frustration, and his gaze turned elsewhere. For Mary, who adored both parents, the unraveling of their marriage was a catastrophe she could not control. The turning point came when Anne Boleyn entered the king's life. To Henry, Anne was not only a source of passion, but a promise of the male heir he longed for. To Catherine, she was a rival who threatened everything. To Mary, she was a silent storm gathering over her young life. What had once been a household of love and security became a battlefield of loyalty. When Catherine was finally set aside, stripped of her title and banished from court, Mary's world collapsed. She was ordered to no longer call herself princess, but the Lady Mary. The father, who had once doted on her, now demanded obedience to his new queen. She refused to recognize Anne Boleyn as lawful, clinging to her mother's honor with the fierce loyalty of a daughter. In that defiance, she showed the first signs of the iron will that would later define her reign. Yet for a teenager, the cost was devastating. Declared illegitimate, Mary was removed from the line of succession. The glittering pageants of her youth gave way to isolation. Once surrounded by attendants, she now lived with a reduced household, sometimes even forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. The humiliation was profound. To those who had once bowed to her as a princess, she was now presented as little more than a reminder of a discarded queen. Her mother's fate weighed heavily on her. Catherine, exiled to distant manors, lived the last years of her life separated from her daughter. Letters passed between them in secret, filled with words of faith and encouragement, but the two were rarely allowed to meet. When Catherine died in 1536, Mary was left without her greatest protector. The loss seared into her heart the conviction that her mother had been wronged not only by Henry, but by the entire course of England's new religious direction. Amid these trials, Mary's character hardened. The girl who once played music in glittering halls became the young woman who spent long hours in private prayer, holding to the traditions of her faith as the world around her changed. She was watched, sometimes pressured to conform, but she resisted. Her defiance was not loud but steady, a refusal to renounce her mother or the old church. Observers at court remarked on her solemn dignity. Even when reduced in status, she carried herself with the composure of royalty. She dressed plainly compared to the extravagance of her father's new court, yet there was a quiet majesty in her bearing. In her eyes shone both sorrow and resolve, the legacy of Catherine's Spanish steel. Thus, Mary's childhood, which began in celebration, ended in tragedy. She had tasted both the privileges of being Henry's daughter and the cruelties of being his pawn. She had been paraded as the jewel of the dynasty and then cast aside as a living symbol of failure. But in that crucible of humiliation and loss, her identity was forged. She would never forget the dishonor placed upon her mother, nor the title stripped from herself. When the time came for her to ascend the throne, she would do so with the memory of those years burned into her heart. For Mary, to rule was not only to govern, but to vindicate her mother, to restore the faith that had defined her childhood, and to reclaim the legitimacy denied her in youth. The shadows of those early years never left her. They became the very foundation upon which her reign would stand. The splendor and the sorrow of Mary's childhood left marks that could never be erased. She had known the brilliance of palaces and the sting of humiliation, the joy of being a cherished daughter, and the anguish of being declared illegitimate. These contradictions did not fade with time. They carved themselves into her spirit. As she moved from childhood into adolescence, the celebrations that had once surrounded her gave way to silence, and in that silence, her true character began to take shape. Humiliation and solitude became the silent tutors of Mary's youth. Once surrounded by ceremony and affection, she now lived in the shadow of rejection. The king's court, with its pageantry and laughter, had turned into a place where she walked carefully, aware that every word and gesture might be measured against her father's will. Yet even as she carried the stigma of illegitimacy, she cultivated within herself an inner fortress that no decree could breach. At the heart of that fortress was her faith. Raised by Catherine of Aragon, Mary absorbed her mother's unyielding devotion to Catholic tradition. When titles were stripped away and allies retreated, she turned inward to the rituals that had defined her childhood. Prayers recited in solitude, the rhythm of the rosary, the sound of Latin liturgy preserved in her memory. These became her companions when human comfort failed. It was not merely piety, but a determination to hold on to the one inheritance that could not be taken from her. Observers noted how seriously she regarded religious duty, even from a young age. While others at court might bend with political winds, Mary refused. To her, faith was not an ornament of identity, but its very core. Every humiliation, every slight, only reinforced her conviction that she was chosen to remain steadfast where others yielded. In the harsh schooling of her adolescence, the principles that would later mark her reign took root. Loyalty to her mother's honor, defiance of illegitimacy, and fidelity to the ancient church. Loneliness shaped her character as much as faith did. Removed from her mother, distanced from her father, and often treated as a reminder of a broken marriage, Mary learned to rely on herself. She grew accustomed to silence, to the cold company of suspicion, to days measured by study and prayer rather than festivity. In that solitude, she discovered a resilience that surprised even those who sought to diminish her. Rather than breaking, she endured, drawing from within the strength that her outward circumstances denied her. For Mary, legitimacy was not only a political question, but a personal wound. She knew she had been born in lawful wedlock, yet the law of her father declared otherwise. The contradiction burned into her sense of self. It was not simply that she had lost her title. It was that the world now regarded her existence as questionable. Such an experience might have broken a gentler spirit, but for Mary it became a lifelong mission. To vindicate her mother and herself, she would cling to every symbol of truth she believed immutable. And in her world, no truth seemed firmer than the Catholic faith. The combination of humiliation, isolation, and devotion forged in Mary a seriousness unusual for her age. While other young nobles laughed in courtly entertainments, she carried herself with the gravity of someone who had already seen too much of fortune's cruelty. Her tutors noted her diligence. Her attendants admired her composure. Beneath the surface, however, the girl carried a heart wounded by rejection, yet strengthened by conviction. She could not command armies or pass laws, but she could remain unshaken, and that steadfastness became her weapon. This early formation would echo through the rest of her life. When opportunities came to compromise, she would remember the lessons of her youth, that yielding brought only loss, and that loyalty, though painful, was a path to vindication. In the stillness of her solitude, she prepared for struggles she could not yet imagine, struggles that would test kingdoms and faiths alike. Thus, Mary Tudor entered adulthood not as the carefree princess she had once seemed destined to be, but as a woman marked by suffering and strengthened by devotion. The child who had been celebrated and then discarded emerged with a mind sharpened by trial. In her private hours of prayer and reflection, she built the identity that would define her reign, a daughter loyal to her mother, a sovereign unwilling to bend, and a believer convinced that endurance itself was a calling. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the crown passed to his 9-year-old son, Edward VI. Too young to rule in his own right, the boy king was guided by powerful protectors. First, his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Both men were deeply committed to the Protestant cause, and under their leadership, the kingdom moved further and faster into Reformation than it ever had under Henry. The old Latin Mass was outlawed, images and relics were swept from churches, and the Book of Common Prayer was introduced to impose a uniform Protestant worship across the realm. What had begun under Henry as a political break with Rome now became a sweeping religious transformation, altering not only the law, but the daily rhythm of faith. For Mary Tudor, Henry's eldest daughter, the new order was a direct assault on the very core of her identity. Raised in the Catholic devotion of her mother, she regarded the Mass not as a matter of preference, but as the sacred truth of salvation. Yet now, as the King's Council imposed Protestant worship, Mary was ordered to abandon the rites she had known since childhood. Her very attendance at Mass, once the expectation of a princess, was now forbidden. The government placed her under watchful eyes. Every movement, every visitor, every word spoken within her household could be reported back to the council. She was commanded to attend Protestant services, to demonstrate loyalty to the young king's laws. But Mary resisted. With quiet determination, she continued to hear the Catholic Mass in secret, gathering with a small circle of loyal servants who shared her faith. In the stillness of private chapels, she clung to the rituals that linked her to her mother, to Rome, and to the unity of Christendom as she understood it. Her defiance was not without risk. Council members debated how far to press her obedience. Some urged leniency, fearing that harsh measures against the king's half-sister might stir sympathy and unrest. Others demanded firmness, insisting that no one, not even a royal princess, could be permitted to defy the law. Letters flew across Europe, for Mary was not alone in her struggle. The ambassador of the Emperor Charles V, her cousin, protested loudly against her mistreatment. In these diplomatic exchanges, Mary became more than a disobedient subject. She became a symbol of Catholic resistance, her private devotions carrying political weight. Edward himself, though young, held strong Protestant convictions. Reports suggest he viewed his sister's defiance with disappointment, perhaps even anger. For the boy king, shaping England into a godly Protestant nation was both duty and destiny. To see his own sister clinging to the old faith was a rebuke to his vision. Yet Mary would not yield. Where others conformed outwardly for safety, she stood apart, refusing to betray what she believed eternal truth. These years hardened her further. The isolation she had known as a girl deepened into a woman's trial. Surrounded by pressure to conform, she bore the weight of suspicion daily. Yet each act of resistance reinforced her sense of mission. The Mass, celebrated in secret, was more than a ritual. It was an act of survival, a declaration that the Catholic faith still lived in England, however small the circle. Those who shared the clandestine services with her did so at personal risk, and in their loyalty, Mary found a fellowship of endurance. At the same time, she saw how swiftly the kingdom was changing. Parish churches stripped of altars and statues, processions silenced, the familiar cadences of Latin replaced with English prayers. All this struck her as a loss not only of faith, but of continuity. She must have felt at times like an exile in her own land, a stranger among her people. Yet the exile strengthened her conviction that one day she might restore what had been taken away. The tension reached its height in 1551 when the council demanded she attend Protestant services under penalty of law. Mary refused outright, writing that her conscience could not bend to human command in matters of God. Threats followed, but she stood unmoved. Only the intervention of the emperor's ambassador, threatening diplomatic reprisal, restrained the council from harsher action. Thus, her defiance was sustained not only by personal courage, but by the shadow of foreign power, an irony that would later complicate her reign. For Edward VI, the years of his rule passed in fragile health. Even as his government pushed reform, his body weakened. Mary observed his decline from a distance, never reconciled with his vision, but never disowning him as brother. She waited, endured, and held to her faith as the kingdom pressed forward into a Protestant identity that seemed, for a time, unstoppable. In these 6 years, Mary's role was not that of a ruler, but of a witness. She witnessed the stripping of the old religion, the rise of new doctrines, and the determination of men who believed they were building a godly commonwealth. Yet she also witnessed the fragility of their power, dependent on the health of a single boy king. Every day she lived under scrutiny, yet every day she chose resistance. These were not years of triumph, but of endurance, and endurance became the hallmark of her character. When the end of Edward's reign approached, Mary stood prepared. She had not compromised, she had not yielded, and she had not forgotten the humiliation of her youth. Through secrecy, through pressure, through the long shadows of suspicion, she had held firm. The years of Edward's rule had tested her as fire tests iron, and from that fire she emerged sharpened, ready for the greater trials yet to come. By the summer of 1553, the boy king's frail health could no longer be concealed. Edward VI, only 15 years old, wasted away from illness, and with his decline came the question that haunted the Tudor dynasty: who would inherit the crown? The line of succession, as written by Henry VIII, placed his daughters Mary and Elizabeth after Edward, despite both having once been declared illegitimate. For Mary, this meant that her path to the throne was legally assured. Yet for Edward's Protestant advisors, her accession was a nightmare. To see Mary crowned was to risk the undoing of everything they had labored for: the Protestant liturgy, the new laws, the very identity of the English Church. It was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who devised the bold plan to prevent this. Ambitious, pragmatic, and fearful of losing power, he persuaded Edward to alter the succession. The king, devoted to the Protestant cause, agreed. Together, they settled on a new heir, Lady Jane Grey, Edward's young cousin and granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister. Jane was devoutly Protestant, highly educated, and, most importantly for Northumberland, married to his son. Through her, the Protestant Reformation could be preserved, and Northumberland could secure his influence at the heart of government. When Edward died on July 6, 1553, his death was initially concealed while preparations were made to proclaim Jane Queen. For 9 days she was hailed by the council and officially declared sovereign. Yet the proclamation rang hollow beyond the walls of London. To many, Mary remained the rightful heir, her claim grounded not in politics, but in the unshakable authority of Henry's will. Across the countryside, news of Edward's death spread quickly, and with it, the question of loyalty. Mary had not waited idly. From her estates in East Anglia, she moved decisively. Writing letters in her own hand, she called upon the nobility and the commons alike to defend her right. Her words carried the weight of legitimacy and the memory of her father, and they struck a chord with those weary of upheaval. The people, long accustomed to the Tudor line, recognized her as Henry's daughter and the true queen. Local gentry rallied to her banner, towns declared for her, and common folk flocked to her cause. The tide turned swiftly. Northumberland marched out with a small force to secure support for Jane, but his efforts collapsed as loyalty drained away. Even members of the council in London, sensing the popular will, began to shift allegiance. Within days, Mary's support swelled into an unstoppable movement. She entered Norwich to acclamation, her presence greeted with bells, processions, and the cheers of crowds who saw in her the restoration of lawful order. Lady Jane Grey, the unwilling queen, found herself abandoned by those who had raised her up. Only 16 years old, she had never sought the crown. It had been thrust upon her by the ambition of others. When the council in London finally declared for Mary, Jane's reign ended as suddenly as it had begun. After 9 brief days, the experiment of replacing Henry's daughter crumbled. Mary's triumph was remarkable not only for its speed, but for its resonance. She had risen from years of humiliation and isolation to claim the crown in a surge of public support. For a woman once declared illegitimate, her victory was nothing short of vindication. It was as if the years of endurance under Edward VI had prepared her for this moment, the moment when legitimacy, faith, and popular will converged in her favor. The death of Edward VI had opened a void that might have plunged England into chaos. Instead, it delivered the crown to Mary Tudor, not by force of arms, but by the force of loyalty and law. Her supporters believed they had restored the rightful line, and Mary herself believed that Providence had granted her the throne for a divine purpose. The young king's passing closed one chapter of the Tudor story, but in its place began another, one that would test England in ways no one yet imagined. Edward's death did more than end a reign. It snapped the last thread holding Northumberland's design together. As Jane's brief sovereignty began to unravel, loyalties in shire and city tilted toward Mary, and what had threatened to become a dynastic rupture turned almost at once into a national restoration. Mary's march toward the throne reached its climax in the late summer of 1553. From the moment the council abandoned Lady Jane Grey and proclaimed her the rightful queen, the realm shifted with astonishing speed. The nobles who had hesitated now bent their knees, the gentry who had wavered pledged their loyalty, and the common people, who had already rallied to her banner in East Anglia, poured into the streets to celebrate her victory. For the first time in her life, Mary saw herself not as an exile within her own land, but as its chosen ruler. On August 3rd, she entered London. The city, which only days earlier had echoed with uncertainty, now roared with acclaim. Crowds lined the streets, filling every balcony, every rooftop, every vantage point from which they could glimpse the daughter of Henry VIII. Bells pealed, banners were unfurled, and the people's shouts merged into a chorus that shook the very walls of the capital. To them, Mary represented the restoration of lawful order, the vindication of the Tudor line, and the triumph of legitimacy over intrigue. For Mary herself, it was the moment when years of humiliation and endurance crystallized into recognition. The symbolism of her accession was profound. Never before had a woman been crowned to rule England in her own right. Queens had existed as consorts, powerful behind the throne but never seated upon it by law. Mary was the first. The sight of her taking her place as sovereign challenged centuries of tradition and expectation. Yet the people received her, not with doubt, but with enthusiasm. Whatever their personal beliefs about faith or reform, they knew her as Henry's daughter, and that heritage carried weight too great to be denied. At the Guildhall, she addressed the city leaders with calm authority. Her words were simple but firm. She promised to govern with justice, to uphold the laws of the realm, and to protect her people. Though her voice carried the softness of a woman, her presence conveyed the steel of conviction. Those who had long dismissed her as a sideline princess now saw in her the dignity of a queen. Her coronation, held weeks later, sealed the moment in ceremonial grandeur. The traditional rites were observed with all their splendor, and though the kingdom's religious future was still uncertain, the pageantry confirmed her power. Nobles, clergy, and commons alike took oaths of loyalty. The crown that had rested upon the heads of her father and her brother now rested upon hers, transforming her from claimant to monarch. The Tudor dynasty, once in danger of fracture, was bound together again under her rule. For Mary, the triumph was deeply personal. She had endured the loss of her mother, the stain of illegitimacy, the years of being watched and restricted, and the pressure to abandon her conscience. Now she stood vindicated. She was no longer Lady Mary, but Queen Mary, her title beyond dispute. The injustice that had haunted her youth seemed, in that instant, to have been swept away by the acclamation of her people. Yet beneath the jubilation, challenges remained. Her council contained men who had served under Edward and still favored Protestant reform. The nobility was divided, some loyal to her faith, others fearful of foreign entanglements. Abroad, her cousin, Emperor Charles V, rejoiced at her accession, seeing in her a chance to restore England to the Catholic fold. The eyes of Europe turned toward her, wondering whether this woman, the first of her line to rule in her own right, would steady the kingdom or plunge it into further turmoil. Mary herself believed her reign had a divine purpose. To her, the crown was not merely an inheritance of blood, but a commission from God. The trials she had endured were not wasted suffering. They were preparation for the task now before her. If she had been preserved through humiliation and danger, it was so that she might lead England back to the faith she believed eternal. The people who had hailed her in the streets expected stability, justice, and continuity. Mary promised these things, and for a moment it seemed possible that her reign might fulfill them. She had claimed the throne not by force of arms, but by force of legitimacy, and that alone made her unique among rulers. The daughter once cast aside had become the sovereign of England, and in her coronation lay the beginning of a reign that would test both her will and her kingdom's destiny. For Mary, the coronation was not only the end of a struggle, but the beginning of a mission. The cheers of the crowds and the weight of the crown confirmed her authority, yet in her heart she believed the throne carried a purpose greater than politics. Every humiliation she had endured, every act of defiance in her youth now seemed to lead toward a single destiny: to restore the faith she had inherited from her mother. From the moment she secured the crown, Mary believed her reign carried not only political, but sacred meaning. She saw herself as more than a monarch continuing the Tudor line. She believed she was chosen by Providence to redeem England from the errors of her father and brother. To her, the break with Rome had been not just a political misstep, but a spiritual catastrophe, a wound upon the very soul of the nation. Now that she was queen, she regarded her mission as a kind of penance to restore England to the Catholic fold, and in doing so, secure its eternal salvation. This conviction shaped her policies from the outset. In her eyes, the kingdom had strayed from the true path, and the responsibility of a sovereign was to guide it back. She spoke of her role not as a choice, but as a duty, a burden placed upon her by God. When she prayed before making decisions, it was with the fervor of someone who believed her actions could determine not only the fate of her people on earth, but their destiny in heaven. The throne, therefore, was no longer merely a seat of power. It was an altar from which she sought to restore unity between England and the universal church. The first step was reconciliation with Rome. This was not an easy task, for the breach had been deep and prolonged. Henry VIII had seized the wealth of the monasteries and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. Under Edward VI, Protestant reformers had gone further still, altering worship and doctrine. To undo these changes required more than ceremonial gestures. It required a deliberate reversal of 2 decades of policy. Mary moved cautiously at first, assuring Parliament that she would not immediately confiscate lands already granted to nobles. She knew she could not alienate the gentry who had profited from dissolution. Yet her ultimate goal was clear: to bring England once again under papal authority. In 1554, Cardinal Reginald Pole, her cousin and a trusted servant of Rome, arrived in England as papal legate. His presence symbolized the bridge Mary intended to rebuild. With Parliament's consent, the kingdom formally submitted to papal authority, erasing the schism that Henry VIII had begun. For Mary, this moment was more than political reconciliation. It was spiritual restoration. She could at last believe that England's soul was healed, its rebellion against the Church forgiven. Alongside this reconciliation came efforts to revive the institutions of Catholic worship. Altars were restored in parish churches, Latin liturgy reinstated, and images returned to sanctuaries long stripped bare. The sound of the Mass, once silenced, filled the air again. Mary believed these measures were not innovations but restorations, returning England to the faith of its ancestors. She envisioned a nation once again united in devotion, its rituals and symbols reflecting a harmony that had been lost. Her commitment extended beyond ceremony. She also sought to revive clerical discipline and education, believing that a reformed and well-trained priesthood was essential for the renewal of faith. Seminaries were planned, and bishops were encouraged to enforce stricter standards upon their clergy. For Mary, the vitality of the church depended on both its outward forms and its inner spirit, and she wished to strengthen both. Yet her vision was not universally welcomed. Among the Protestant minority, resistance simmered quietly. Many had come to embrace the new liturgy and teachings, and for them, the return to Rome was not healing, but betrayal. Even among those less committed to doctrine, there was unease about foreign influence, particularly Spain and the papacy. Mary, however, remained unmoved. To her, compromise was not possible in matters of salvation. Where her father had defied Rome for personal desire and her brother had yielded to reform for political expedience, Mary believed she was correcting their errors with the authority of divine will. It is easy from a later perspective to see in her policies a stubbornness that alienated her subjects, but at the time, Mary viewed her reign as the fulfillment of her entire life's suffering. She had endured rejection, illegitimacy, and exile from her father's favor because she had refused to forsake her faith. Now seated on the throne, she believed she had been vindicated, not for her own sake, but so she might lead her people back to truth. Each act of restoration, each altar raised, each prayer sung in Latin, was to her an offering that repaired the breach between England and God. The challenge ahead was immense. Religious division had already taken deep root, and unity could not be imposed by decree alone. Still, Mary held fast to the conviction that she was chosen as the instrument of reconciliation. If her father had broken with Rome and her brother had carried reform further, then she would be the queen who healed the fracture. Her reign, in her own eyes, was nothing less than the redemption of England's soul. Mary's dream of reconciliation with Rome gave her reign its sacred purpose. Yet dreams alone could not bind a fractured kingdom. Altars restored and Latin prayers renewed might heal symbols, but they could not erase the divisions that had already taken root in English hearts. To Mary, the danger was clear. As long as Protestant voices preached openly, the unity she sought would remain fragile. If her mission was to redeem England's soul, then tolerance of what she deemed heresy could not be allowed. Mary's vision of restoration could not be achieved by ceremony alone. To her, unity of faith demanded not only altars restored and Latin prayers renewed, but also the rooting out of heresy. She believed that truth could not coexist with falsehood, that the survival of the Catholic Church in England required the silencing of doctrines she regarded as dangerous. From her perspective, the Protestant faith was not simply an alternative vision of Christianity. It was rebellion against divine order, a poison that, if left unchecked, would spread through the soul of the kingdom. Thus, in 1554 and 1555, her government moved decisively. The old laws against heresy, dormant since her father's reign, were revived. Parliament, under pressure from the Crown, enacted statutes that made refusal to accept Catholic doctrine punishable by death. For Mary, this was not cruelty, but duty, the protection of souls from eternal error. She was not alone in this conviction. To many of her advisors and bishops, the enforcement of orthodoxy was a sacred responsibility, as natural as defending the realm against invasion. To tolerate heresy was, in their minds, to endanger not just the nation, but the salvation of its people. Soon, the machinery of persecution began to turn. Those who openly preached Protestant ideas, who refused to attend Mass, or who denied Catholic doctrines were summoned before ecclesiastical courts. Some recanted under pressure, returning to the fold. Others, more steadfast, refused to yield. For them, the penalties were severe. At Smithfield in London and in towns across England, the condemned were executed in public view, their defiance silenced in the flames. The sight of these punishments left a deep impression on contemporaries. Crowds gathered to witness them, some out of fear, others out of morbid curiosity, and still others out of sympathy for the condemned. For Mary and her ministers, these spectacles were intended as warnings, a visible demonstration that the old faith was restored and must be obeyed. Yet for many, they became something different, a theater of martyrdom. The courage of those who died for their convictions inspired others, ensuring that the ideas Mary sought to extinguish would continue to burn in hidden hearts. Among the most notable victims was Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer had been one of the chief architects of the English Reformation. author of the Book of Common Prayer and a central figure in shaping Protestant theology in England. To Mary, his guilt was personal as well as political. He had declared her mother's marriage invalid, legitimized Anne Boleyn, and stood as a living symbol of the upheavals that had defined her childhood. His very existence was a reminder of the dishonor placed upon Catherine of Aragon and upon Mary herself. Cranmer was imprisoned, interrogated, and pressured to recant. At moments of weakness, he signed statements submitting to papal authority, perhaps in hopes of saving his life. But in the end, when faced with execution, he reversed himself once more, declaring his Protestant convictions openly. His final words were reported and circulated, and his death became one of the most remembered of Mary's reign. For her supporters, it was justice served on a dangerous heretic. For her opponents, it was proof that the Protestant cause had martyrs of unshakable faith. The executions multiplied over the course of her reign. Bishops such as Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer, once leaders of reform under Edward VI, were put to death. Ordinary men and women, preachers, artisans, and laborers also met the same fate. Records suggest that nearly 300 people were executed for heresy during Mary's reign. Each death added to a growing sense that the Queen's restoration of Catholicism was built upon fear rather than consensus. Mary herself did not see these measures as excessive. In her mind, she was no tyrant but a shepherd defending her flock. She believed she was saving England from divine wrath, purging the land of false teaching to secure God's blessing. In her conscience, the flames that consumed heretics were fires of purification, burning away corruption so that truth might shine more clearly. She even expressed sorrow that people forced her hand, seeing in their deaths not triumph, but tragic necessity. Yet perception is often stronger than intention. To many of her subjects, especially in London and the southern counties, where executions were most frequent, Mary became associated with fear. The sight of smoke rising from Smithfield became a grim symbol of her rule. The nickname Bloody Mary, though coined later, reflected how her reign was remembered as a time when conscience could cost a person their life. The Queen, who had entered London in triumph, was now spoken of with dread. The consequences of these policies were paradoxical. Rather than extinguishing Protestant belief, they gave it heroes. Stories of the martyrs spread in whispered accounts and printed pamphlets smuggled from abroad. Families remembered the names of neighbors who had died bravely, and these memories hardened Protestant identity. The very acts meant to restore unity deepened division. For every soul reclaimed to the Catholic faith through fear, another was bound more tightly to Protestant conviction through defiance. Mary was not oblivious to the costs. She lamented privately that her subjects resisted the return to Rome. She longed for reconciliation rather than punishment, but her understanding of reconciliation demanded submission. To her, truth was singular, and any refusal of it was rebellion against God. She could not imagine a kingdom where two faiths coexisted. To permit such diversity would be, in her view, to betray her divine commission. Her advisors, too, reinforced her resolve. Bishop Stephen Gardiner and Cardinal Pole supported the policy of strict enforcement. Continental examples offered precedent. In Spain and the Netherlands, heresy was treated with equal severity. Mary did not believe she was acting unusually. Rather, she thought she was joining the broader effort of Catholic Europe to suppress the Protestant tide. But the English experience was different. The kingdom had already lived through 2 decades of religious upheaval. Many subjects had grown weary of change, uncertain whether to trust the authority of crown, parliament, or church. For such people, the executions seemed not a defense of truth, but another turn of the wheel of persecution. They had seen reforms imposed under Henry, then intensified under Edward, and now reversed under Mary. To them, it was not faith, but politics that dictated the religion of England, and the fire of Smithfield became the emblem of instability. In this way, Mary's attempt to heal the breach paradoxically widened it. She restored communion with Rome, yes, and she reestablished Catholic ritual, but she also entrenched Protestant opposition, creating a legacy of bitterness that her successor Elizabeth would later inherit. The very actions meant to safeguard Catholic unity ensured that when her reign ended, the memory of persecution would make reconciliation all but impossible. The queen herself remained steadfast. Until her final days, she believed she had acted rightly. In her conscience, she had done what was necessary to save England's soul. The judgments of later generations could not shake her conviction that she had fulfilled her duty. Yet history remembered differently. The courage of the martyrs, the smoke of Smithfield, and the defiance of figures like Cranmer etched themselves into the national memory. Thus, Mary Tudor became forever entwined with the image of fire. To some, it was the fire of purification, a queen burning away the falsehoods of heresy to restore the light of truth. To others, it was the fire of cruelty, consuming the innocent and branding her reign with terror. Between these two visions lay the complexity of her rule, a woman of deep conviction shaped by suffering, determined to heal her land, but whose methods cast a shadow that endured long after her death. And so, the mission she had embraced to restore England to the Catholic faith succeeded in form, but failed in spirit. For though she reunited her kingdom with Rome, the hearts of her people were not wholly one. Instead, the flames lit under her reign illuminated a path she never intended, a path that would lead, after her death, to the triumph of the very cause she had fought to extinguish. Mary's determination to defend the old faith had been absolute, yet the cost of that determination spread far beyond the court or the councils of state. What she saw as duty was remembered by her people in darker tones. The flames that to her symbolized purification, to many became the emblem of terror. And in that gulf between intention and memory lay the seed of the name that history would fasten upon her. The fires that burned in Mary's reign left marks not only on the bodies of the condemned, but upon the conscience of a nation. Ordinary people carried away memories of smoke rising over city squares, of neighbors led to trial for refusing the Mass, of whispered prayers uttered in fear. These impressions spread faster than proclamations or statutes. Fear became the undercurrent of daily life, and the Queen, who had once entered London to cheers, now inspired unease. It was not immediate that Mary was given the name by which she is remembered. In her own lifetime, she was called the Queen, the Catholic, or simply Mary. But stories began to circulate, carried by merchants, exiles, and pamphlets smuggled from abroad. They spoke of the executions at Smithfield and Oxford, of defiance met with fire, and of a monarch whose faith demanded severity. These stories, repeated and embroidered, became part of the shared imagination of England. Long after her death, when Protestants consolidated their triumph under Elizabeth, the label Bloody Mary took hold, distilling years of complex policy into a single word of condemnation. The reaction of contemporaries was mixed, but fear was its strongest note. For the devout Catholics who supported Mary, the punishments were regrettable but necessary, lamented as tragic duty. For Protestants, they were evidence of tyranny. The suffering of friends and leaders turned into rallying cries. Even for the indifferent, those less concerned with theology, the uncertainty of what one could safely say or believe cast a pall over ordinary life. A realm that had once known religious variety under Henry and Edward now seemed patrolled by watchful eyes, where conscience itself felt dangerous. This atmosphere hardened the lines of division. The martyrs of Mary's reign became symbols to their followers, their stories carried by those who escaped into exile on the continent. In Strasbourg, Zurich, and Geneva, English refugees published accounts of what they had seen. The most influential came later in John Fox's Acts and Monuments, a monumental chronicle of Protestant suffering that would be read in parish churches for generations. In its pages, Mary's image was fixed forever, a queen of persecution, a ruler remembered not for her intentions, but for the flames lit under her command. The power of such memory was immense. Few reigns have been so defined by a single epithet. Henry VIII had been ruthless in dissolving monasteries and executing opponents, yet he was not remembered by a name of blood. Edward VI had overturned centuries of worship in a handful of years, yet his youth shielded him from infamy. Mary, by contrast, became a symbol, her identity reduced in popular imagination to the shadow of fire. The cruelty of her policies was magnified by their contrast with her image as the first woman to sit upon the English throne. To many, the hope that had greeted her accession turned into disillusionment, and disillusionment gave way to fear. The impact of this legacy stretched far beyond her lifetime. When Elizabeth ascended the throne, she inherited not only a divided realm but also the memory of her sister's severity. It gave her Protestant settlement a moral authority, for it could be framed as liberation from terror. The stories of Mary's reign were retold to justify Elizabeth's compromises and to strengthen England's new identity as a Protestant nation. Over time, the figure of Bloody Mary became a cautionary tale, invoked whenever rulers seemed too severe, whenever faith was enforced by fire rather than persuasion. Mary herself never imagined such an outcome. She died convinced she had done God's will, that her measures, however harsh, were necessary for the salvation of her people. She saw herself as a guardian of truth, not as a tyrant. Yet history remembers not only actions but perceptions. The whispers of fear in her reign became louder than her intentions, and the memories of martyrs outlasted her proclamations. Thus, the epithet Bloody Mary was not merely a label, it was the crystallization of a nation's trauma, the reduction of a reign into a single image of dread. It testified to the enduring power of memory, how fear written into the lives of ordinary people could shape the story told for centuries. In England's national consciousness, Mary became less a complex queen than a symbol of what happens when faith and fire meet unchecked power. For generations, the phrase passed from tongue to tongue, severed from its original context, surviving as folklore as much as history. Children learn the name without knowing the details, associating her reign with darkness. Preachers used it to contrast the truth of their own time with the errors of the past. And historians, though more cautious, could not escape the weight of the reputation that had grown around her. In the end, Mary's epithet was less about her person than about England's memory of itself. It marked a chapter when conscience was tested by crown, when belief could mean peril, when hope turned into fear. The woman who had sought to save her nation's soul became the figure most remembered for kindling dread in it. And so, Bloody Mary endured, echoing through history as one of the most haunting names in the long story of the English crown. The weight of that reputation, whispered in fear, carried in stories, and etched into memory, might have defined Mary entirely, yet her reign was shaped by more than persecution. For even as the fires of Smithfield cast their shadow, another matter pressed upon her. With equal urgency, the need for an heir. Without a child, all her efforts to restore the Catholic faith risked vanishing at her death. And so, from the embers of controversy, arose another defining chapter of her rule, the search for a marriage that could secure both her dynasty and her mission. Marriage had always been one of the sharpest tools of dynastic politics, and for Mary Tudor, it became both an opportunity and a peril. By the early years of her reign, she was in her late 30s, past the age at which most queens were thought likely to bear children. Yet her desire for an heir burned with intensity. Without a child, her achievements in restoring Catholicism might prove fleeting, swept aside the moment she died. With an heir, especially one bound to the Catholic faith, she could secure the permanence of her work. It was within this context that the prospect of marriage to Philip, heir to the vast dominions of Charles V, emerged. For Mary, the match promised strength, legitimacy, and continuity. Philip was not only a prince of Spain, but a man destined to rule one of the greatest empires of Christendom, stretching from the Americas to the Mediterranean. To join her fate with his was to ally England with the might of Catholic Europe. It seemed, at least from Mary's vantage, providential, a partnership designed to reinforce her mission of reconciliation with Rome. But politics rarely unfold as simply as faith or intention. Among her counselors and her people, the match stirred unease, even dread. Memories of England's long struggle against foreign dominance were still raw. Many feared that in wedding, Philip Mary would hand her kingdom over to Spain, reducing England from a sovereign power to a satellite of Habsburg ambition. Pamphlets and ballads spread anxieties that English law and liberty would be smothered by Spanish influence. Even some of her most loyal subjects worried that the marriage would mean soldiers in English streets and foreign lords at the helm of English governance. Mary heard these voices but pressed forward. Her devotion to the Catholic cause aligned with her dynastic calculations. She believed the marriage would strengthen her against Protestant opposition at home and hostile powers abroad. To her, it was not a surrender, but a salvation. Yet the manner in which the alliance was negotiated only deepened suspicion. Ambassadors and envoys discussed dowries and inheritance rights, while Mary herself seemed guided more by her trust in Providence than by sensitivity to national sentiment. When the match was announced in 1554, rebellion flared. The Wyatt Rebellion, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, sought to prevent the Spanish marriage and to place Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister, upon the throne. The revolt was crushed, but it underscored how deeply the proposed union unsettled the realm. For Mary, it was a wound, a sign that her people doubted her judgment, that they feared her happiness would mean their bondage. Yet she refused to bend. If anything, the rebellion hardened her resolve, convincing her that she must see the marriage through to assert her authority. The wedding itself took place on July 25, 1554, in Winchester Cathedral. The setting was magnificent, a solemn ceremony, rich vestments, and the union of two monarchies witnessed by bishops and nobles. To Mary, it was the fulfillment of hope. She appeared radiant, convinced that at last she had found both a husband and a partner in her sacred mission. For Philip, however, the occasion was political rather than personal. Nearly a decade younger than Mary, he approached the match with detachment. His role, as he saw it, was to secure the Habsburg alliance and advance his father's designs. The contrast between them was palpable. Mary's joy, her open devotion to her husband, her belief that their union was divinely ordained, all shone through her demeanor. Philip, courteous but reserved, maintained a formality that betrayed little warmth. To him, the English crown was a responsibility, not a romance. He was careful not to overstep the marriage treaty, which limited his authority in England and declared that the kingdom would not be annexed to Spain. Yet his foreign retinue, his language, and his distance reinforced the impression that he was an outsider. Among the people, suspicion never faded. They whispered that Mary had surrendered herself to foreign power, that English policy was now driven by Madrid. Each time Spanish courtiers appeared in London, unease deepened. Parliament itself, wary of Spanish dominance, resisted Philip's influence, ensuring that his title as king consort brought him little real control. For Mary, this resistance was painful. She longed for her husband's acceptance by her people, just as she longed for their acceptance of her faith. But affection cannot be legislated, and the divide remained. Still, Mary clung to hope that the marriage would bear fruit in the form of an heir. Her court buzzed with anticipation as she reported signs of pregnancy. Bells rang in London, prayers were offered across the kingdom, and hopes soared that a child would secure the Catholic succession. Yet the hopes proved false. The Queen's supposed pregnancies ended in disappointment, leaving her not only without an heir, but humiliated in the eyes of both her people and foreign observers. To Mary, the failures were deeply personal, undermining her sense of divine favor. To Philip, they were reminders that the English match might never provide the stability he sought. Despite these disappointments, Mary's devotion to her husband remained steadfast. She wrote to him with affection when he was abroad, yearning for his return. He, ever cautious, responded politely but coolly, his attentions drawn to the wider demands of empire. Their marriage was thus unequal in feeling. For Mary, it was a union of hearts and purpose. For Philip, it was a matter of policy, a duty fulfilled, without tenderness. The consequences of this imbalance rippled through her reign. Politically, the Spanish alliance entangled England in continental conflicts, drawing the kingdom into war with France, a war that would lead to the catastrophic loss of Calais, England's last foothold on the continent. Socially, the marriage alienated her subjects, confirming fears that Mary placed foreign interests above English ones. Personally, it left her vulnerable, a queen deeply in love with a husband who did not share her fervor. In the larger canvas of English history, the marriage symbolized the gulf between Mary's vision and her people's desires. She believed she was securing the Catholic future of her kingdom. They believed she was surrendering its independence. She saw in Philip the hand of Providence guiding her mission. They saw in him the shadow of Spain looming over their liberties. And yet, for all its failures, the union remains one of the most human episodes of Mary's reign. It reveals not only her political calculation, but also her longing, the longing of a woman who had endured loneliness, humiliation, and rejection, now seeking companionship and legitimacy. The tragedy was that the very marriage she hoped would strengthen her crown instead deepened the isolation that defined her rule. The marriage that Mary had embraced with such devotion did not remain a private matter of crown and hearth. With Philip came not only a husband but an empire, and with that empire came obligations that reached far beyond England's shores. What she regarded as a sacred union of hearts and faith soon revealed itself as a political bond tying her kingdom to the great contests of Europe. Marriage bound Mary to Philip, and with him came the entanglements of empire. England, once an island kingdom focused largely on its own survival, suddenly found itself tethered to the great struggles of continental Europe. For Philip, the war against France was not optional but inevitable, a continuation of the rivalry that had dominated Habsburg ambitions for decades. For Mary, it was the cost of alliance, the price of standing at the side of the most powerful monarch in Christendom. Yet for her subjects, the consequences were bitter. England's interests had long been distinct from those of Spain. Many believed their island kingdom had little to gain and much to lose by plunging into continental wars. The memory of campaigns in France, stretching back to the 100 Years' War, still lingered, and the people knew too well how easily English treasure and blood could be spent across the Channel with little to show in return. The thought that their queen had now committed them once more, not for their own cause but for her husband's, fed the perception that England had surrendered independence. Mary herself saw the matter differently. She believed that to support Philip was to support Christendom, to defend the Catholic faith against France, whose alliance with Protestant forces made them seem doubly threatening. In her eyes, to fight alongside Spain was to wage not merely a political war, but a sacred one, a defense of the faith she had sworn to restore. And yet, her conviction clashed with the reality of her kingdom's resources. England was not the vast empire of Spain. Its coffers were limited, its army small, and its people weary of burden. When war finally came in 1557, it did so at Philip's urging. England declared war on France after a series of provocations, but few doubted that the true reason lay in loyalty to Spain. The conflict quickly exposed England's weakness. Troops were dispatched, funds drained, and hopes placed on victories that never materialized. For Philip, the English contribution was useful but minor compared to the vast Habsburg forces he commanded. For Mary, it was a test of loyalty, proof that she was willing to bind her kingdom's fate to her husband's. The war's most devastating consequence for England came in 1558 with the loss of Calais. This last remnant of the medieval English presence in France had endured for more than 2 centuries as a symbol of national pride. To see it fall, almost without a fight, was a humiliation beyond measure. For the people, it confirmed every fear they had held about the Spanish marriage, that England was being dragged into wars not its own, with nothing to show but disgrace. For Mary herself, the loss was a personal wound. She reportedly declared that when she died, the word Calais would be found engraved upon her heart. The foreign policy of Mary's reign, therefore, became one of its most criticized features. Instead of securing England's place in Europe, it seemed to reduce it, making the kingdom appear a junior partner in Spain's grand designs. Nobles who had once supported the marriage now questioned its worth. Merchants who traded across the Channel saw their profits vanish. Ordinary people who had once hailed their queen in triumph muttered that their burdens grew heavier with little cause. Yet Mary never repented of her course. To her, loyalty to Philip was loyalty to the Catholic faith, and loyalty to the faith was loyalty to God. She could not separate her personal devotion from her political alliances. The union with Spain was not, in her mind, a concession of sovereignty, but a fulfillment of divine purpose. The war with France, though costly, was a part of that larger struggle. History, however, judged differently. The loss of Calais overshadowed her efforts at home, staining her reign with the mark of failure in foreign affairs. To her people, it was proof that their queen had placed the needs of a foreign husband above those of her kingdom. To later generations, it became one of the defining tragedies of her rule, a symbol of how her devotion and her policies, however sincere, had left England weakened on the world stage. The humiliation of Calais weighed heavily upon Mary, yet even as foreign. Affairs darkened her reign. Another matter closer to her heart consumed her thoughts. If wars could tarnish a crown, an heir could redeem it. To secure the future of her faith and dynasty, she turned inward to the hope that had eluded her for so long, the hope of a child. For Mary Tudor, the hope of a child was more than the natural longing of a wife. It was the keystone of her reign, the safeguard of her faith, the one promise that could transform her fragile present into a lasting future. From the day she married Philip, she had dreamed of cradling a prince in her arms, a child who would unite bloodline and creed, ensuring that Catholicism would not only be restored, but perpetuated. To Mary, motherhood was not simply a private desire, it was destiny. In 1554, not long after her wedding, signs seemed to confirm her prayers. Her body gave evidence of change. Swelling in her abdomen, the absence of her courses, the stirrings that she interpreted as life. Physicians confirmed the possibility. Courtiers whispered with excitement, and across England bells rang in anticipation. The announcement was treated as fact. Nobles prepared to celebrate. Towns planned festivities, and prayers rose daily from parish churches. At last, it seemed, the Queen who had suffered so much would give England an heir. The court, which had been tense with divisions, now seemed united by joy. For Catholics, the prospect of a Catholic heir meant triumph, a secure future against reformers. For Protestants, even those who still harbored hope for Elizabeth, the pregnancy seemed to close the door on their cause. The child within Mary was imagined not only as a royal infant, but as the very embodiment of the Catholic restoration. Every expectation, every plan revolved around this unborn figure, already invested with the weight of a kingdom's destiny. As the months passed, the Queen prepared herself. Chambers were arranged for confinement, midwives appointed, swaddling clothes and christening gowns readied. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in detail about the expected birth, and Europe watched eagerly. Even Philip, often distant, showed cautious optimism, knowing that a son would secure not only Mary's legacy, but his own influence in England. But the day of delivery came and went. The Queen's abdomen remained distended, but no child appeared. Time stretched forward, and the truth became undeniable. There was no heir. What had seemed so certain was revealed as illusion. Physicians spoke quietly of tumors, of natural irregularities, of disorders beyond their knowledge. For Mary, the revelation was crushing. She had built her hopes, her legitimacy, even her faith upon this expectation. To see it collapse was to feel the foundation of her reign tremble beneath her. The disappointment echoed through the kingdom. Bells that had rung in anticipation fell silent. Courtiers who had prepared gifts and proclamations muttered in confusion. The people who had prayed with fervor now shook their heads in doubt. If the Queen could not provide an heir, what then of the future? The Protestant cause, thought buried, seemed once again possible. Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister, regained stature in whispers and in plots. The phantom pregnancy, more than a personal sorrow, became a political disaster. Yet Mary's faith did not falter. She told herself that God had tested her, that another chance would come. In 1557, her hopes rose again. Once more, her body showed signs that seemed unmistakable. Once more, the court buzzed with anticipation, the nation held its breath, and proclamations were drafted for the birth of a prince. Once more, Mary dreamed of the moment when she would place her child in the arms of a priest for baptism, sealing England's Catholic destiny. But again, the hopes dissolved. There was no child, only the cruel reminder of her own frailty. The Queen, who had survived years of exile and rejection, who had restored the Mass and faced down rebels, could not overcome the limits of her body. Each disappointment left her more isolated, more sorrowful, more determined to cling to the faith that had carried her through every other trial. If she could not give England an heir, she would at least give it back to God. For her subjects, however, the second false pregnancy confirmed their fears. Many began to whisper that the Queen was cursed, that her marriage to Philip had brought misfortune, that the kingdom's future could not rest upon her. Protestants took heart, seeing providence in her failure. Catholics, though still loyal, grew uneasy. The silence in the royal nursery, the empty cradle, became symbols of a reign that could not secure its own continuation. Mary bore the humiliation with dignity, but never escaped its sting. She continued to rule, continued to believe, continued to pursue her mission of reconciliation, but the shadow of childlessness hung over every decision. She knew that without an heir, Elizabeth stood next in line, and with her, the Protestant cause. Every failure of her body was a triumph for her enemies. Every silence in her chambers an unspoken prophecy of reversal. The phantom pregnancies, therefore, were more than medical curiosities. They were turning points, shaping how her reign would be remembered. To her people, they symbolized false hope, the betrayal of expectation, the futility of her policies. To her, they were crosses to bear, reminders that suffering was part of God's design, that her duty was not to question, but to endure. In the wider arc of history, they came to embody the tragedy of Mary's life. She had longed for love and found only formality. She had longed for unity and found division. She had longed for children and found emptiness. Yet in each longing she persisted, holding fast to the faith that had sustained her since childhood. The queen, who once knelt alone in a chapel, abandoned and declared illegitimate, now knelt again, abandoned by her body, but still reaching upward in prayer. Her phantom pregnancies were not just failures of nature. They were symbols of her reign itself, filled with hope, announced with triumph, yet ending in disappointment. They revealed both the depth of her yearning and the limits of her power. And though they left her people disillusioned, they also revealed the indomitable spirit of a queen who, even in sorrow, believed her life was guided by the hand of providence. The false pregnancies did not only crush Mary's personal hopes, they also altered the course of her marriage and her standing with her people. Each failed expectation widened the gap between her dreams and the realities that hemmed her in, leaving her not simply disappointed, but profoundly alone. The queen, who had imagined herself surrounded by children and the laughter of heirs, instead found herself enclosed in silence, mocked by whispers in the streets, and abandoned in all but name by the husband she adored. Philip had never been a man of deep affection, but the absence of an heir chilled his interest in England further. His loyalties were to Spain, to the Habsburg dynasty, to the wider struggle against France and the Protestant states of Europe. Once it became clear that Mary could not give him a son, his visits to her kingdom grew shorter, his departures more swift, and his returns less certain. He spent increasing time abroad, attending to imperial business, while Mary remained in England, waiting, longing, and writing letters that were answered with cool politeness. She loved with the desperation of a woman who knew her days of youth and childbearing were behind her. He loved with the detachment of a ruler who weighed kingdoms more heavily than hearts. This distance was noticed. Courtiers, ambassadors, and common citizens alike whispered about the coldness of the Spanish king consort. Rumors circulated that he regarded his English wife as little more than a stepping stone to continental power. Some suggested cruelly that he despised her, that he avoided her presence whenever possible. For Mary, these rumors were daggers because she could neither deny her affection nor compel his. She was left to endure the silent chambers of her palace, where the cradle prepared for an heir remained empty, a mute reminder of her greatest sorrow. Her people, too, grew restless. The joy that had once greeted her accession had long since curdled into skepticism. Many had endured her restoration of Catholic ritual with reluctant obedience, but the phantom pregnancies turned disappointment into derision. Ballads and lampoons circulated, mocking the queen's swelling body and empty nursery. In taverns and marketplaces, people whispered that God had cursed her, that her inability to bear children was a judgment upon her reign. The same nation that once hailed her triumph now laughed behind closed doors, their pity sharpening into scorn. The cruelty of such mockery was that it targeted the most personal wound. Mary had survived political humiliation, had withstood open rebellion, had defied her brother's counsel and her sister's plots. Yet the ridicule of her womanhood, the laughter at her failed hopes for a child, cut deeper than any conspiracy. It left her isolated not only from her people but from her own sense of worth. She was a queen, yet she was also a woman whose greatest longing had been denied, and the world seemed eager to turn her sorrow into spectacle. The isolation grew heavier as Philip withdrew. When he did return, it was often brief and overshadowed by matters of state. He treated her with courtesy, even with deference, but seldom with tenderness. For Mary, each encounter was bittersweet, filled with the joy of seeing him again, but shadowed by the knowledge that he would soon depart. Her letters reveal a woman who clung to hope, pleading for his presence, while he, ever pragmatic, reminded her of obligations elsewhere. The distance between them was not measured only in miles, but in the very fabric of their marriage. She yearned for companionship. He sought advantage. This imbalance left her vulnerable, for her emotional dependence on Philip blinded her to the resentment growing at home. Many English subjects saw him not as a partner of their queen, but as a foreign master whose influence dragged England into wars it could not afford. The loss of Calais deepened this anger, and the sight of their queen pining for a man who seemed indifferent only fueled their discontent. To them, Mary appeared not as a sovereign leading with strength, but as a woman weakened by devotion to a husband who gave little in return. Loneliness pressed upon her in other ways as well. Elizabeth, her half-sister, lingered always in the background, young, vibrant, Protestant, and increasingly popular. For those disillusioned with Mary, Elizabeth became a symbol of an alternative future. Mary saw this and felt it as betrayal, even when Elizabeth treaded carefully. The Queen's inability to secure her own line made her rival's presence unavoidable, and each false pregnancy, each empty cradle, was a silent coronation for Elizabeth. Thus, Mary's later years were marked not by triumph, but by solitude. She carried the crown, but she bore it without joy. The pomp of ceremonies, the trappings of majesty, the rituals of court, all seemed hollow when her chambers were silent, and her letters unanswered. She prayed with fervor, seeking consolation in faith, yet even prayer could not silence the whispers that mocked her. The loneliness became both a private grief and a public weakness. A queen who had once inspired loyalty now seemed diminished, her reign reduced to disappointment. Her efforts to restore Catholicism were overshadowed by ridicule, her alliance with Spain by suspicion, her personal hopes by failure. The people did not speak of her with reverence, but with pity and derision. And pity, as Mary knew, is as corrosive to a ruler as hatred. And so, in the twilight of her reign, Mary Tudor stood as a figure of paradox. She had achieved what no woman before her had done, ruling England in her own right, restoring her faith, allying with the most powerful dynasty in Europe. Yet she was remembered not for her strength, but for her sorrow, her body, her marriage, her motherhood. The most intimate elements of her identity became the subjects of gossip and satire. The queen became a woman again in the eyes of her people, not exalted but diminished, defined by absence rather than presence. The image of Mary in these final years is that of a ruler surrounded by pomp, but pierced by solitude. She had once entered London in triumph, hailed by her people as the true heir of Henry VIII. Now she moved through her palaces as a lonely figure, her husband far away, her people disillusioned, her hopes for a dynasty extinguished. The empty cradle stood as her most eloquent monument, a reminder that even queens are bound by the limits of flesh, and that even crowns cannot protect against the cruelty of hope betrayed. By the late 1550s, Mary's body began to betray her as surely as her hopes for an heir had done before. The queen who had endured humiliation and rebellion, who had clung to faith against every storm, now faced the slow erosion of her strength. What began as fatigue and vague discomfort grew into relentless pain, a sickness that physicians could neither cure nor fully understand. To modern eyes, the symptoms suggest cancer of the womb or ovarian disease. But in her own time, it was an enigma that drained her vitality day by day. Her courtiers saw the change first in her face. Once proud and resolute, her features grew pale and drawn, her movements heavy, her energy fleeting. She could still appear in council, still summon the determination of a monarch, but the vigor that had carried her through the first years of her reign was gone. Those who watched her saw not only a queen burdened by care, but a woman fighting an invisible adversary within her own body. Mary herself refused at first to admit weakness. For years, she had been accustomed to suffering, the loneliness of her childhood, the indignities of being cast aside, the pain of false pregnancies. She had learned to endure sorrow with silent fortitude. Now she treated her illness in the same way, rising to prayer, speaking of duty, reminding herself that her reign was an instrument of God's will. But as the months passed, her strength ebbed, and even her indomitable faith could not hide the truth. Her body was failing. The symptoms grew harder to ignore. She suffered swelling, exhaustion, and bouts of weakness that left her unable to walk without assistance. Her appetite faded, her voice grew faint, and long audiences or ceremonies became nearly impossible. Physicians tried poultices, diets, and herbal remedies, but their efforts offered no relief. At a time when medicine was more guesswork than science, the Queen's suffering remained. Beyond remedy, whispers spread through court and city alike. Some believed she was again with child, clinging to the hope of a miracle heir. But as weeks stretched into months, it became clear that no infant stirred within her. Instead, the swelling was the cruel sign of disease. To her enemies, it seemed divine judgment. To her friends, it was the cross of a queen who had carried too many burdens. Mary bore her decline with the same dignity that had marked her trials before. She withdrew more often into private chambers, attended by a small circle of ladies and chaplains. Prayer became her constant companion, the solace for a body that no longer obeyed her will. She asked for masses to be said, for candles to burn in chapels, for her people to remain steadfast in the old faith. Even in pain, her thoughts turned outward, toward the cause she believed God had entrusted to her, yet isolation deepened. Philip, long distant, was absorbed in his continental responsibilities. Letters arrived from Spain, respectful but detached, while Mary longed for presence, for comfort, for a sign that her sacrifices had not been in vain. Instead, she was left with her illness and the knowledge that the kingdom she had fought to restore might slip away upon her death. The very heir she had once deemed illegitimate, Elizabeth, now stood in the wings, poised to succeed. The Queen's chambers grew quiet, her appearances rare. Those who saw her were struck by the contrast between the authority of her crown and the frailty of her frame. Once she had entered London in triumph. Now she was carried through her halls, a figure diminished by sickness, yet still holding to the dignity of sovereignty. Her decline was not only physical, but symbolic, a living metaphor for a reign whose ambitions had been vast, but whose legacy now seemed uncertain. Thus, in the autumn of her life, Mary Tudor confronted the final trial, the betrayal of her own body. She who had survived exile, humiliation, rebellion, and ridicule was undone not by enemy armies or treasonous plots, but by an illness that drained her strength and dimmed her flame. And yet, even as her body failed, her spirit clung to the same conviction that had defined her since girlhood, that she was God's servant, chosen to bear suffering, if only to uphold the faith of her fathers. As Mary's body faltered, so too did the foundations of her reign. The Queen, who had entered London in triumph only a few years earlier, now found herself surrounded by doubt, suspicion, and disillusionment. Her policies, once pursued with conviction, had left scars that neither her faith nor her authority could erase. The restoration of Catholicism, secured by fire and statute, had alienated wide swathes of her people. The Spanish marriage, meant to strengthen her dynasty, was seen instead as surrender to foreign influence. The war with France, culminating in the humiliating loss of Calais, stood as a national wound. Piece by piece, her credibility unraveled. The persecutions weighed heavily on her reputation. For Mary, they were the defense of truth, the necessary sacrifice to preserve souls. For her subjects, they became the defining feature of her rule. The smoke of Smithfield lingering longer in memory than any act of devotion. Her sincerity could not shield her from the perception that she had ruled through fear rather than love. The nickname Bloody Mary, though crystallized later, had its roots in these years, in the whispered resentment of her people who longed for an end to the terror of conscience. Her alliance with Spain deepened the estrangement. Philip, often absent and emotionally distant, came to embody the foreignness that so many Englishmen feared. His presence was seen as interference, his wars as burdensome distractions. The court filled with Spanish courtiers only reinforced the sense that Mary had surrendered English independence. Where she had imagined a union ordained by God, her people saw the shadow of a foreign master, Every absence of Philip widened the gap between queen and country, and every letter from Spain reminded the nation that their sovereign's heart was tethered elsewhere. The military failures compounded the sense of decline. The fall of Calais in 1558 was more than a strategic loss. It was a psychological blow. For generations, Calais had symbolized England's foothold in France, a reminder of past glories in the Hundred Years' War. Its sudden loss was felt not only as a military defeat, but as the end of an era. To many, it proved that Mary's reign was cursed with weakness, that her policies had squandered both treasure and honor. She herself felt the loss so deeply that she's said to have declared Calais engraved upon her heart. Yet for her subjects, it was not a noble tragedy, but another reason to despair of her rule. Into this atmosphere of disappointment stepped Elizabeth, the half-sister who had long been watched with suspicion, but who now became the natural focus of hope. Everything about Elizabeth seemed to stand in contrast to Mary. Where Mary was aging and frail, Elizabeth was youthful and vigorous. Where Mary was bound to Spain, Elizabeth projected independence. Where Mary clung to the old faith, Elizabeth embodied the Protestant cause that many now saw as England's future. She was, in the imagination of the people, the antidote to the ills of the present. Elizabeth's caution added to her allure. She was careful never to provoke her sister openly, but she allowed herself to be seen as patient, clever, and pragmatic. Exiles and reformers whispered her name abroad, while courtiers at home began to hedge their loyalties, quietly aligning themselves with her cause. Even those who did not share her faith found in her a symbol of renewal, a chance for England to escape the burdens of Spanish entanglement and religious persecution. Mary, weakened in body and isolated in spirit, could see the shift. She understood that her sister's star was rising, that her own failures had become Elizabeth's opportunity. It was not betrayal that elevated Elizabeth, but inevitability. In the harsh light of comparison, Mary appeared diminished, while Elizabeth shone brighter with every passing day. The queen, who had once fought so hard to secure her legitimacy, now faced the reality that her reign would be remembered as a prelude to another's. Thus, by the final months of her life, Mary Tudor's authority was hollowed out. She still wore the crown, still commanded the rituals of state, but the substance of power was slipping away. Her people no longer looked to her with hope, but endured her rule while waiting for what came next. Elizabeth, silent yet ever-present, became the vessel of their longing. Mary's reign, once hailed as restoration, now seemed a passage of suffering that the nation must outlast. In this collapse lay the full measure of her tragedy. She had fought to save England's soul, but in the process had lost its heart. Her enemies triumphed not through rebellion or conquest, but through her own missteps, through the loneliness of her body, and the burdens of her policies. The queen, who had sought to redeem her nation, now stood eclipsed by the sister who would inherit her throne. And in the contrast between them, Mary's reign found its final judgment, a chapter of sorrow, giving way to a new beginning. By the autumn of 1558, Mary Tudor was a shadow of the queen who had once ridden through cheering crowds to claim her throne. Illness had wasted her body, political defeats had eroded her reputation, and the solitude of her private life had pressed upon her like an ever-tightening vice. She had prayed for renewal, for reconciliation, for a child who might carry forward her faith. Instead, she faced the end with no heir, no husband by her side, and no certainty that her life's mission would endure. Her last weeks were spent largely within the chambers of Whitehall, attended by a few loyal ladies and clerics. The court, restless and watchful, already looked beyond her, preparing for the succession they knew could not be delayed. Ambassadors wrote home with reports of her failing health, and ministers quietly began to shift their allegiance toward Elizabeth. The queen's presence lingered like a solemn ritual, but power itself had already begun to pass from her hands. Mary bore her decline with a mixture of resignation and sorrow. She prayed constantly, heard Mass daily, and clung to the conviction that she had done God's will, however misunderstood. Yet even in prayer, there were shadows. She knew Elizabeth would succeed her, and with that succession, the Protestant cause would rise again. It was the deepest irony of her reign. After years of struggle, sacrifice, and persecution, the restoration she had worked so fiercely to achieve would unravel the moment she breathed her last. Her thoughts, in those waning days, turned often to Philip. She longed for his presence, for comfort, for the assurance of a husband's hand. But Philip remained abroad, absorbed in the vast concerns of empire. Letters arrived, respectful and dutiful, but distant. Mary, who had poured her devotion into him, died, knowing that her love had not been returned in kind. The loneliness of her marriage became the loneliness of her deathbed. As her strength ebbed, the court prepared for transition. Elizabeth was summoned closer, though not yet crowned, and her allies waited in readiness. To many, the passing of Mary was already history before it had occurred, the closing of one chapter and the expectation of another. Servants moved quietly through the halls of Whitehall, their voices hushed, their footsteps muted, as though the palace itself anticipated the moment. On November 17th, 1558, Mary Tudor's long struggle came to its close. The queen, who had fought so fiercely for faith and legitimacy, slipped into silence. Around her, the rituals of devotion continued, prayers murmured, candles flickering, but the woman at the center of them had gone. The throne of England, vacant once more, passed to Elizabeth, the half-sister she had once feared and distrusted. The news spread quickly through London. Bells tolled, though the sound was less a lament than a signal of transition. Many mourned, but many more welcomed the change, their hopes pinned on Elizabeth. For Mary, death brought not the triumph of vindication, but the stillness of defeat. She had lived convinced that she was chosen to redeem her nation's soul. She died, knowing that her work would be undone. And yet, her reign left an imprint that could not be erased. The persecutions, the phantom pregnancies, the foreign alliance, the loss of Calais, all became part of the memory of England. To some, she was a martyr for faith. To others, a tyrant of conscience. But in her final hour, she was simply a woman, weary and alone, surrendering crown and life alike. Thus ended the reign of Mary Tudor, first Queen Regnant of England. The flame that had burned so fiercely in her conviction flickered out within the walls of Whitehall, leaving behind both the sorrow of her failures and the shadow of her legacy. In the stillness that followed, England turned toward a new dawn, one that would be shaped not by the woman who had just died, but by the sister who now lived to inherit her crown. History has rarely been kind to Mary Tudor. In the centuries that followed her death, one name overshadowed all others: Bloody Mary. It became a label so enduring that it eclipsed the complexity of her life and reign. To generations of Protestants, she was the embodiment of cruelty, the monarch whose fires consumed the faithful, the queen whose reign was defined by terror. Her image hardened into caricature, a figure of dread invoked from pulpits and in chronicles, a warning against the dangers of intolerance and zeal. Yet the reality of Mary's life was far more complicated than the epithet allowed. She was not born to be a symbol of persecution. She was shaped by a lifetime of rejection, betrayal, and fervent belief. From her childhood, when she saw her mother cast aside and herself declared illegitimate, to her lonely years under suspicion during Edward's reign, Mary had learned to equate faith with survival. Catholicism was not simply a creed for her, it was the foundation of her identity, the anchor that sustained her when every worldly support was stripped away. Her reign must be understood in that context. To Mary, the Protestant reforms of her father and brother were not just changes in ritual, but an existential rupture, a tearing apart of the sacred fabric of her nation. Her mission was to mend what had been broken, to return England to the unity of the Church that had given meaning to her suffering. The persecution of heretics, however terrible in hindsight, seemed to her as natural as defending her borders or safeguarding her throne. In her mind, there was no cruelty, only necessity, the salvation of souls at the cost of lives. This does not excuse the pain her policies inflicted, but it does explain the depth of her conviction. Unlike her father, whose religious changes were often driven by political calculation, or her sister, who would later temper faith with pragmatism, Mary acted from an almost unyielding sincerity. She truly believed she was God's instrument, chosen to heal her country and redeem its sins. That such devotion led to flames in Smithfield and the alienation of her people is the tragedy of her reign, but it was also its essence. a woman whose faith outpaced her world. In judging her, historians have long struggled between condemnation and sympathy. For Protestant chroniclers like John Foxe, Mary was the perfect villain, the tyrant whose actions justified their cause. His Book of Martyrs enshrined her image as the persecutor-in-chief, ensuring that every English parish for centuries would hear her name in the context of suffering and fire. Later generations schooled on these tales found it impossible to see her as anything other than a figure of horror. But more recent voices have sought to recover the humanity behind the myth. They remind us that Mary was the first woman to rule England in her own right, breaking centuries of precedent. They point to her courage in seizing the crown against formidable opposition, to her resilience in enduring personal humiliation, and to her sincerity in a world where few rulers acted from conviction rather than expedience. They see her less as a monster and more as a tragic figure, a queen caught between personal faith and political reality, doomed by the very earnestness that defined her. The truth of Mary Tudor's legacy lies somewhere between the extremes. She was both persecutor and victim, both determined ruler and isolated woman. Her reign revealed the dangers of uncompromising faith in an age of upheaval, but it also exposed the human cost of religious and dynastic strife. To reduce her to Bloody Mary is to deny the complexity of a life forged in suffering and guided by belief. To excuse her entirely is to forget the lives lost under her command. And so, her image in history endures as paradox. She is remembered as a symbol of cruelty, yet also as a woman who bore the weight of her times. Her failures cleared the path for Elizabeth's triumphs, and her shadow sharpened the light of the reign that followed. If her name became a warning, it was also a testament to the intensity with which she lived her faith. In the end, Mary Tudor was neither saint nor monster, but a tragic queen whose legacy still flickers between fire and devotion, a reminder of the cost when belief and power intertwine too tightly. Among the legacies of Mary Tudor's reign, none loomed more heavily than the shadow of Spain. Her marriage to Philip II, conceived as a bond of faith and power, placed England within the orbit of the Habsburg Empire. To Mary, this was providence, a sacred alliance that tied her kingdom to the greatest Catholic power of the age, a bulwark against heresy and France alike. To her people, however, it was submission, a reminder that the sovereignty won through centuries of struggle might be slipping into foreign hands. From the beginning, suspicion haunted the Union. English merchants feared the dominance of Spanish trade. Nobles muttered against the influx of foreign courtiers. Ordinary people worried that their queen had become a pawn of Madrid. Each gesture of loyalty to Philip reinforced these anxieties, and each absence of her husband made the arrangement appear both hollow and dangerous. The sense that England had lost control of its destiny gnawed at the national imagination. The war with France, entered on Spain's behalf, cemented this perception. The loss of Calais was not only a humiliation but a tangible proof that foreign entanglements brought disaster. For centuries, Calais had symbolized England's foothold on the continent. Its fall under Mary confirmed to many that Spanish influence was a curse rather than a blessing. In taverns and parlors, people began to say openly what they had long whispered, that England's true interests were not served by union with Spain, and that the Queen's devotion to her husband had blinded her to her kingdom's needs. Mary herself never wavered. To her, loyalty to Philip was loyalty to God's order. She could not separate the personal from the political, or the marital bond from the spiritual mission. Yet this very conviction tied her reputation to Spain's fortunes. And when those fortunes faltered, so too did her own. The Spanish shadow, cast across her reign, made her appear less a sovereign in her own right than a consort to a foreign prince. For a people proud of their independence, this was intolerable. Ironically, the very failures of this alliance prepared the stage for England's future independence. When Elizabeth inherited the throne, she carried with her the memory of her sister's unpopular marriage and the resentment it had provoked. Elizabeth learned from Mary's missteps. She understood that binding England too closely to Spain would risk the same resentment, and she positioned herself carefully, outwardly cautious, inwardly determined to assert her nation's autonomy. It was this memory that gave Elizabeth leverage in shaping her foreign policy. She could resist Spanish demands, flirt diplomatically with France, and build alliances that served England's interests, all while reminding her people of the cost of Mary's devotion to Philip. The shadow of Spain, though oppressive in Mary's time, became a lesson for her successor. England must chart its own course, even in a continent dominated by great Catholic monarchies. In the longer view, Mary's Spanish connection altered the trajectory of English identity. It sharpened the sense of national difference, encouraging Protestants and even moderates to see England not as a partner in Catholic Europe, but as a distinct and independent power. The resentment of foreign control, born in the years of Mary's marriage, fed into the patriotism that would flourish under Elizabeth, culminating in the confrontation with the Spanish Armada 3 decades later. The very marriage that had seemed to threaten England's sovereignty became the catalyst for a stronger sense of independence. Thus, the shadow of Spain is inseparable from Mary's memory. It represented her deepest loyalty and her greatest failure, a bond she believed divinely ordained, but one her people saw as betrayal. And yet, in its aftermath, it shaped the destiny of the realm she left behind. For Elizabeth, it was both a warning and an opportunity, a reminder of how easily a queen could alienate her subjects and a chance to define her reign in opposition to her sisters. In this way, Mary's Spanish alliance left a paradoxical legacy. It tarnished her own reputation but illuminated the path for the age that followed. The queen who tied her crown to Spain unwittingly ensured that her successor would claim glory by breaking free of it. The shadow of Spain that darkened Mary's reign became the backdrop against which Elizabeth's England stepped into the light. Mary Tudor's life and reign endure as one of the great tragedies of the 16th century. She was a woman of unshakable conviction who sought to heal her nation by binding it once more to the faith of her childhood. Yet her devotion, sincere and steadfast, collided with the political and spiritual upheavals of her age. In that collision, she became not merely a queen, but a symbol of the dangers that arise when faith, power, and politics are woven too tightly together. To contemporaries, Mary seemed a paradox. She was the daughter of Henry VIII, whose own break with Rome had severed England from its ancient moorings. She was the wife of Philip II, whose empire represented the height of Catholic ambition in Europe. And she was the first woman to rule England in her own right, a pioneer whose achievement was overshadowed by failure. Every aspect of her life carried the weight of history, and every decision she made reverberated beyond her own time. Her tragedy lay in the sincerity of her aims. She did not scheme for personal glory, nor did she cloak her policies in pragmatic calculation. She believed, with all her being, that she was chosen to restore England to its rightful place within the universal church. In pursuing that goal, she sacrificed popularity, prosperity, and even the affection of her people. She endured mockery, loneliness, and decline, yet she never abandoned the conviction that guided her. That conviction, admirable in its courage, was also devastating in its consequences. The epithet Bloody Mary has long defined her, yet it is too narrow to capture her true place in history. Her reign was not only about persecution, though the fires of heresy remain its most enduring memory. It was also about the perils of absolutism in belief, about the fragility of legitimacy when tethered to foreign alliances, about the limits of a monarch's body to secure dynastic continuity. She embodied the hopes and fears of her century, and in her failures she revealed the profound tensions of a world in transition. Mary's story is thus not merely the account of one woman's reign, but a mirror held up to the 16th century itself. It was an age when religion could still command armies, when conscience could cost lives, when monarchs were judged not only by victories and treaties, but by their fidelity to the true faith. In such an age, Mary's determination could not help but collide with the tide of change. She stood against the current, and the current swept her away. Yet her legacy was not entirely darkness. By embodying the extremes of devotion, she offered her nation a lesson that would shape its future. Elizabeth, her successor, learned from Mary's errors, choosing compromise where Mary chose absolutism, and cultivating independence where Mary tied herself to Spain. The stability of Elizabeth's reign, the flowering of English identity, and the emergence of the kingdom as a Protestant power all grew in part from the failures of her sister. Mary's tragedy thus became Elizabeth's opportunity, and through that opportunity, England's transformation. For later generations, Mary remains a warning. She shows how easily a ruler's sincerity can become a weapon, how faith pursued without balance can alienate those it seeks to save. She reminds us that zeal, however noble its intent, can harden into tyranny when yoked to power. Her reign, remembered with dread by some and with sympathy by others, is a testament to the human cost of extremes. In the end, Mary Tudor was not the monster of Protestant legend nor the saint of Catholic hope. She was a queen shaped by sorrow, driven by faith, undone by circumstance. She sought to redeem her nation but left it divided. She longed for love but died alone. She dreamed of a Catholic heir but yielded the crown to a Protestant sister. Her life was a chain of contradictions, and her reign a parable of devotion transformed into tragedy. Thus the memory of Mary endures as a flame that burned too fiercely, as a cautionary tale of faith entangled with power, as a reminder that even the sincerest heart can leave behind a legacy of sorrow. In the quiet halls of history, her name is still spoken, not only as a byword for cruelty, but also as a symbol of the human cost when conviction blinds compromise. Mary Tudor's reign may have ended in failure, but her story continues to illuminate the perilous path of rulers who believe too deeply, and of nations caught in the crucible where belief, politics, and destiny collide.